look, I just wanted to acknowledge the staff that have been involved with regards to the process, and also yourself, Your Worship, for recommendation D. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I have no other comments to make. I just want to acknowledge Councillor Filipaina's role in this and helping to facilitate what I think is an appropriate outcome. So thank you very much for that, Alf. Much appreciated. So I'll put those recommendations as amended by the Chair's recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
To the contrary,
Aye.
no. I declare that carried, and I think unanimously, unless somebody wanted to express their dissent. No, I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you very much to officers for that. We come now to the Eden Park Trust Board submission to the 2022-23 annual plan, and this is to consider a request for funding, quite a significant amount of funding, $6.8 million a year ongoing from Eden Park. I have a set of, I don't know whether we've got the recommendations that are on screen. They're up there, yep. In fact, they're right in front of me. Can I ask Deputy Mayor Cashmore to move that? Councillor Filipaina, would you like to second that?
Kia ora.
And I'd like to now invite Peter Gudsell, our Chief Financial Officer, to speak to the paper and to the recommendations.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will work through the paper, given it was a late paper. Then myself and other staff are available for any questions that follow. Please note that this is an open session, so if there are commercially sensitive areas, I may need to be limited in my response. So the purpose of this report is to consider the request for funding received from Eden Park Trust during the annual plan 2022 consultation process. The current development funding agreement between Auckland Council and the Eden Park Trust Board concludes in June this year. And through their annual budget submission, which is, as we know, publicly available submission, that's also attached to the report. The Eden Park Trust Board have requested the $6.28 million of grant funding for the next financial year, His Worship referenced, and ongoing. This request sits outside existing grant funding processes and allows appropriate consideration within the context of Auckland Council's overall financial position. And this is a key point, as it allows consideration with a full understanding of Council's overall financial position. We know that this is challenging, with the need for preparation for ongoing gaps of 90 to 150 million. This next year is managed through the Three Waters Better Off funding, general rates increase of 3.5% and prudent use of debt. The request is based on an Ernst & Young report from 2018. This report outlines a $62.8 million 10-year maintenance refurbishment capex plan, and the $6.28 million per annum request aligns to 1/10 annually of the total identified in the plan from 2018. Eden Park Trust Board submission highlights that Eden Park will be hosting 9 matches for the upcoming FIFA Women's World Cup 2023, and states that the funding sought is critical to ensure Tamaki Makaurau maintains its reputation as a state-of-the-art modern dynamic city, as opposed to a city with failing assets. Council staff have corresponded with and met with MB, NZ Football, Tātaki Auckland Unlimited and Eden Park. These discussions have canvassed asset condition and specific FIFA World Cup requirements, noting the request references a 2018 assessment rather than indicating any compliance or criticality items. Now, as with any large asset, fully funding depreciation and adequate capital expenditure is necessary to ensure the infrastructure is maintained to a high standard and meets delivery requirements. Funding for Eden Park Trust Board request has not been included in the annual budget 22-23, and there are no existing planned funding sources for this. Eden Park Trust Board is an independent entity, and the trust deed sets out its objects. Given key decisions for the annual budget were made on 7 June, that includes the rate levels, mentioned expenditure budgets, a decision to provide ratepayer funding for this third party would be funded through additional council debt. Staff recommend that Eden Park Trust use its existing loan capacity, and Auckland Council forgives interest payment on any additional loan drawdown until 30 June 2023, whilst the council group through Tātaki, Auckland Unlimited and Eden Park Trust continue to work on a single stadium operating model for the city's stadiums. This provides a short-term solution that allows Eden Park Trust Board to self-manage its own objects within its trust charter, and also allows the partnering opportunities to continue and address the medium term. If I look at recommendations, the recommendations are that the governing body agree to advise Eden Park Trust Board that their existing loan capacity with Auckland Council can be used to fund capital requirements if required, and agree and delegate all necessary powers to the Chief Executive for Auckland Council to undertake that. And the council group through Tātaki, Auckland Unlimited continue to work on a single stadium operating model for the city stadiums. Further recommendation C, note council staff will engage with Eden Park Trust as required on its debt capacity limit if operating performance is impacted adversely by COVID-19. And this is written like this for a number of reasons, referring back to the 2018 annual report of Eden Park Trust Board. It mentioned that enabling 6 concerts per year as a permitted activity would underwrite Eden Park's financial viability for the next 10 years. We also know that this year they've had full houses, they've got AB All Black tests coming on. Next year there's FIFA World Cup and some concerts. And the latest annual report signed off on a going concern basis, and their debt covenant certificates as at 30 April signalled no concerns. All of that is subject to COVID-19 and snap lockdowns, of course, which is why recommendation C is in there for that comfort. Further context, on 19 March 2019, Finance and Performance agreed to provide the Eden Park Trust Board with funding as follows. I'll take this all of read, you've seen this a number of times. Since the 2019 loan consolidation, I'm on paragraph 9 now, Eden Park can draw on a council loan facility of up to 54 million, and it had accessed 48.75 million as at 21 June. The current development funding agreement does end on 30th of June, does end next week, and I can confirm that is effectively fully being drawn down. In accordance with Clause D, Eden Park presented their performance highlights impact of COVID-19 to 17 March Finance and Performance Committee meeting. Council staff considered the presentation prior to that meeting, and as it signalled some financial sustainability risks, the Trust was advised that any request for future funding should be through an annual budget submission, so that it could be part of the context of the overall Council position. And in accordance with that advice, the Trust submitted a funding request to Auckland Council through a submission on the draft annual plan. And as we know, that is publicly available. I covered 12 earlier. And in 13, I've covered that it works from the Ernst & Young report from 2018. It is worth noting that a number of items in the plan have been funded through the current development funding agreement. So moving to paragraph 14, the funding request identifies a schedule of projects, although costing is not included, and you can refer to attachment A for those, which the Trust intends to address over the next 3 years, noting that it is appreciated that these cannot all be achieved and that the asset management plan is fluid over time. Eden Park Trust Board submission highlights those 9 matches with FIFA Women's World Cup that I've previously mentioned, and states that funding sought is critical, with the phrase that I've covered off earlier. 16 I have covered. 17, staff do recognise that Eden Park's asset management program has implications for asset quality now and in the future, and would further mention that FIFA requirements, minimum standards, investment levels, etc. are for Eden Park Trust Board to manage. Irrespective of any upcoming events, it is important that an ongoing solution is found and discussions continue on that basis. Financial considerations. As with many organisations, including the Council, Eden Park's post-COVID-19 financial situation is uncertain. The Council itself is in a position where it has challenging finances and has no funding in the annual plan for this request. Eden Park Trust loan facilities has an additional $5.25 million that may be drawn down, and if this was fully drawn down, Eden Park Trust would incur around $125,000 of additional interest costs, unless the Council agreed to forgive interest payments on the loan as foreshadowed in the recommendation. Forgiving those interest payments in 22-23 would also need to be funded from additional Council borrowings. Should Eden Park Trust find the operating performance to be worse than forecast, Council staff would engage with them on the debt capacity limit as required. I've mentioned in 21 that borrowings would be required. That would also be the case if a decision was made to provide grant funding as Eden Park Trust Board has requested. It would also have to fund the associated interest costs. It would seem to be out of step with work already underway to uncover partnering opportunities, and this is a cogent point given recommendation C from when the development funding agreement was put in place remains ongoing. There are longer term considerations that need to be in play as well. As just mentioned, the DFA was put in place for 3 years on the understanding we would jointly prepare an operational partnering proposal and seek to amend the Eden Park Trust deed to appropriately align the governance of Eden Park with funding. Further to this, in July 2020, the review of CCOs recommended that Tautaki Auckland Unlimited explores at the Council's direction the critical need for joint management and operation of the city's 4 stadiums with Eden Park Trust. Tautaki Auckland Unlimited and Council staff continue to progress a proposal for a single stadium operator for the city stadiums with the Eden Park Trust Board. And I do have support online there with Richard Clark if we want to have a question around any of these areas later. While progress has been made, they have not yet been concluded. And obviously the Council needs to decide how to get the best out of the stadiums that it owns and also consider the extent to which it provides ongoing financial support to Eden Park. If I move through to Council Group impacts, just talked about paragraph 28. 29 points out that that single stadium operating model should improve the operational performance of the stadium network. And as a result, it is the view of Tautaki Auckland Unlimited that the consideration of Eden Park Trust Board's request should be limited to a 12-month horizon or until a decision has been made on the outcome of a single stadium operating model. Local impacts and local board views talks to the process undertaken during the annual budget consultation and feedback round. 32 talks to no impact in that space. 33 talks to the financial implications of forgiving the interest payments, and 34 reiterates that debt funding is the only lever available at this point. Risks and mitigations. There is a risk that the Eden Park Trust Board may decide not to use their existing loan capacity due to a desire to maintain debt headroom. To mitigate this risk, we suggest and have recommended signalling that staff will engage with Eden Park Trust as required on its debt capacity limit if operating performance is impacted adversely by COVID-19. At the time of writing this report, engagement was still ongoing, and I can now update the governing body of what has happened since the report was finalised late Tuesday afternoon. So I'll do that now. On Tuesday night, I received an email from the CEO of Eden Park. This reiterated the need contained within their public budget submission request for funding to support infrastructure minimum standards. Their CEO indicated that the trustees were concerned they could be in breach of their duties if they took on more debt. Given this position, staff professional advice has been sought. On the first aspect, paragraph 17 has covered this item, where we recognise that asset maintenance program has implications for asset quality in the future, and I also mentioned that FIFA requirements, minimum standards, investment levels, etc., for Eden Park Trust Board to manage as within the objects of their trust charter. So I believe I have Bram or James online who can now talk to the second point of any concern that trustees might have around taking on that additional debt.
Right, do we have one of the aforesaid people online? Bram.
Kia ora, Councillors and Mayor. Just to recap quickly on those issues, the trustees of the Eden Park Trust Board are able to access borrowings under their trust deed. From what we understand, we can't see any particular solvency or that type of risk for them in borrowing more or accessing more under these facilities. The trust is obviously very highly capitalised with a very large balance sheet. So the only practical issue that they will have to address is that they've sort of got enough working capital, which is more about the level or the headroom in the facility rather than the use of a facility as such. And we've been provided with no details specifically why using an increased facility should be problematic for them, at least in the meantime, until we progress our discussions throughout the rest of this year.
Thank you very much, Bram. Have you anything further you want to add?
Yes, I'll just quickly finish off. So I'd also note the last debt covenant compliance certificate received, valid as at the end of April. The outlook was positive and there was no concerns contained within that. With regard to having a sufficient debt headroom, that was why recommendation C is part of the staff recommendation. So even given this response, which is understandable as it is entirely natural and rational to prefer a grant to a loan, it is my professional advice that the recommendations remain valid. They provide a viable short-term solution while continuing work is able to happen on a medium-term solution with regard to the operational partnering. The next steps for us will be, after decisions are made by governing body, we'll communicate that back to Eden Park Trust Board and action any subsequent implementation that governing body decides upon. So, Your Worship, I'll now pass back to you for any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. Look, I might just go to our Chief Executive, Jim Stabak, first, and then see if Auckland Unlimited wants to make any further comment. But Jim, your assessment of the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, just a couple of additional comments to those made by the CFO. By way of context around what's shaped this set of recommendations, we understood there were two primary reasons why the Eden Park Trust Board preferred a grant. One was they were reluctant to take on any additional operating expense, which would of course be interest cost, in light of the ongoing impacts of COVID-19 on their operating revenues. Our offer in that respect was to forgive interest on any amount drawn down from the existing capacity in their loan. Thereby relieving them of any additional OPEX burden as a consequence of having to proceed with the works that they believe are necessary. The second concern that we understood Eden Park Trust Board to have was that they were keen to preserve some capacity in their existing debt facility to be able to respond to unforeseen, as yet not realised, shocks that might be coming down the track. And we all understand, the sorts of things that might represent those sorts of impacts. And that's, as Peter said, that's what informed what's become recommendation C. That is, if we were to give Eden Park Trust Board an undertaking that should they draw down on the existing capacity in their loan, that is that part of the loan that they were keen to preserve in order to be able to respond to shocks, and a shock did occur that required them to be able to access additional funding, then we would engage with them in a conversation around potentially extending the debt facility to accommodate their ability to respond to that event when it occurs. So rather than preserve the capacity for something that might happen, give them an undertaking that we would engage with them should that occur in the future. And really it's those two dimensions, that is mitigating any operating expense impact as well as preserving their ability to respond to unforeseen events that shaped our recommendation in this regard. The third thing I would say is it's an existing facility. Drawing down on that facility would mean that the debt sits with the entity making the investment in the asset that they own. That's the appropriate place for it. And additionally, it would give Eden Park Trust Board and management the ability to get on with the work activity really quickly. They wouldn't be reliant on any other kind of bureaucratic process that might get in the way of them being able to start the work quickly. So that's the set of circumstances that we understood and which shaped our recommendations for this paper.
Thank you very much, Jim. Now, I'll just come to Auckland Unlimited. I can see Nick Hill, and I've got Malcolm Laurie, and I've got Richard Clark. So is there anybody from Auckland Unlimited that would like to contribute? Nick, give you the right of first refusal.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. All I'll add to the discussion so far is to confirm that we are actively and constructively working through the single operator model with the Eden Park Trust Board, and that work will, at least to some extent, should it proceed, have a bearing on how the challenge of meeting these maintenance and serious major maintenance issues for Eden Park would be addressed under that model. So it would be premature to take a long view about what that exposure is.
Thank you very much, Nick. So look, we'll now move to questions. So I have the first question from Councillor Chris Darby.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for everybody working on this. And Mayor, I know this report had to come a little bit late because it's been prepared late with good reason. So hopefully my questions don't sound too naive. Just, Peter, I was reading the recommendation B Roman 1, and I was reading it until you explained it. I was reading it like the interest was forgiven for that period, but it continued to accrue, and then it would be due. But then I heard your explanation, and I heard that it is forgiven for that period. It doesn't accrue. It's not due for that period, and it would cost us $125,000. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Your subsequent understanding based on a better verbal explanation than a written one is correct.
Okay, that's interesting. Sorry, somebody else wanted to say something there, Mayor, I think.
No, I think we're just having a bit of trouble with the tech, Chris. So if you go ahead.
Okay, so it's an additional $125,000 cost to council. We have to take that from borrowings, additional borrowings. Peter, fundamental question for me is the Eden Park entity solvent?
Thank you for the question, Councillor, and back through His Worship. I have spent some time reviewing the last 5 annual reports. Annual reports are obviously the audited position and financial position of the entity. Each one of them requires the trust to have a going concern consideration as part of the sign-off, and they have met that well. We also have our debt covenant requirement, and they also have been meeting that. So I can't give you an answer other than the information available in front of me, but I would expect that if there was any concerns around solvency, that the trustees would bring that to Council's attention, given we are the debt holder for them, and that would be required under the debt covenant agreement. So a short answer
thanks.
is I believe so.
Yeah, okay, we believe so. It would be good to maybe get that in writing at some point, because I remember asking the chair that question 2 years ago, and I got a very unclear answer. And I sitting over this and the liability for the council, Mayor, I think we just need to make sure that that trust has access to assets that can match its liabilities. But thank you, Mayor. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kathy Casey.
Thanks, Phil. Peter, I've got 3 questions in no particular order of importance. The first one is, can you just talk to the governing body with regard to the FIFA requirements? We've had a workshop on this, but this is now in the public arena. When Eden Park told this council that the requested funding was for critical infrastructure to make sure the matches went ahead, you tested that out in a number of ways. Could you talk to the governing body with regard to that due diligence that you did, and whether you agreed in the end with the Eden Park's critical need for funding?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. We have engaged in a number of discussions on this point. What has become clear is that this really is a discussion between Eden Park and FIFA. So the way in which the funding request is positioned is around the need for longer term assets and the criticality of that. And we've recognised that under paragraph 17. But I do believe that FIFA requirements, minimum standards, investment levels are for Eden Park Trust Board to manage itself. And it's important that really we focus on that ongoing solution and those discussions that are continuing on that point, which allow for ongoing asset maintenance decisions to be made at a network level.
So, Peter, this is a change of position for you in the advice you gave to the council the last time that this was referred to us.
I don't know if it's a change in position, Councillor. It's a position based on my understanding of discussions with the parties that I've mentioned, NZ Football, Tātaki Auckland Unlimited and Eden Park, and it's a reflection of the need to focus on the longer term quality of assets as opposed to a particular event. Also, it is a better match to the request that has been put in based on a 2018 asset management position and the recommendations that were put in place in that time around the partnering aspect.
So when you advised the council the last time that after your due diligence that you didn't believe that FIFA had made these critical requirements, you have changed position on that. You're saying, well, you haven't changed position, you're now saying that that's as maybe, but it's not for us to say.
Councillor, this is an open session and that one was confidential. I'm not able to make any comment on compliance issues. That's outside of my remit for FIFA and Eden Park Trust Board.
Okay, my second question relates to 2 paragraphs. That's paragraph 19 and paragraph 33, and already Councillor Darby has mentioned it. Can you advise me if Eden Park, if this does go through and Eden Park is forgiven the interest, that we would be up for up to $125,000 and no more? That's question one.
That's a reasonably good estimate. If the entire loan was drawn down on day one, I believe I calculated it would actually be 129,000. However, the 125 is a pretty good proxy of the upper limit.
Okay. Can you then tell me where this money comes from?
Yes, there is no amount that's been set aside in the budget for this support, so it would be an increase in the debt position and the ongoing impact of that.
In Council's debt position?
That's correct.
Thank you. My third question relates to paragraph 31, and I'm truly puzzled by paragraph 31 in respect to local board input. When you say that no local board gave feedback on the Eden Park funding request, did the local boards actually know that Eden Park had made a funding request? And if so, how was that communicated to them?
I can't talk for the local board's knowledge of that space. However, all submissions are public, so the submission itself was raised in a public forum.
I'll just repeat my question, Peter. I know that Eden Park made a submission, but in the report, which is you have authored, you have said that no feedback was received from the local boards on the Eden Park funding request. And I'm asking you, how did we, the council, how did we make it known to the local boards that Eden Park were requesting regional funds that we're discussing today?
Kia ora, Councillor Casey. So the requests for funding were outlined or highlighted to the Finance and Performance Committee at your workshop on the 4th of May, at which local board chairs were present. The submissions are also been available online since that date, along with the overall regional funding report, regional feedback report, which included information on the funding requests that had been received through the submissions.
Thank you. So can I just be clear that at no stage were local boards asked particularly for their view on whether we should fund Eden Park with regional funds?
That's correct.
We didn't ask them that. Okay, thank you. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Pipacoom.
Thanks, Mayor. Kia ora, Peter and team. My partai goes sort of a similar follow-on question from Councillors Darby and Casey just about the interest payments. Can you just clarify, Peter, so the interest payments, if we cover the interest and it comes off our debt, is that essentially funding OPEX through debt? Is that correct?
It is funding the debt position of Eden Park for that 1 year, and it isn't something that sits particularly nicely with our requirement in the budget to have a prudent use of debt. So it's very much a last resort, given we have no other funding options at this stage, and if we were to decide to do this, it would have to be applied to debt.
So it is classified as OPEX, using debt for OPEX.
The interest that attaches to the debt position that Eden Park would be taking on is OPEX, yes.
Yeah. So through the annual budget, we've been, I mean, you've kind of said that. So it's not what you would normally advise, that we shouldn't, we've gone through the annual budget and have been advised that that's not prudent to use OPEX, use debt to fund OPEX.
We have to be really careful that we have a prudent use of our debt position, that's correct, and maintain our path towards that 100% fully funding of depreciation. And within the budget documents that are being finalised for next week's adoption, we can clearly see how our appropriate use of debt in next year still maintains that funding position. But this is not something that I would normally advise. That is correct.
Thank you for that clarification. I did appreciate you walking us through the report as well. I'd like that on every report we receive. Would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. If we had
Sorry,
that
was
on
a
every
compliment,
report,
Peter.
we'll be...
It didn't come across right. It's a nice thing to be spoon-fed a report like that.
Yeah, it's not normal to do that, but it was a late report, and that's why the CFO did it. If we did it on all papers, Councillor, we'd be here till late this evening. The last question I've got is from Councillor Wayne Walker, and then we'll come to comments. Councillor Walker.
So I've just got a few questions by way of context, and it may well be that Nick Hill could assist. My understanding is that the FIFA Women's World Cup and the 9 matches in Auckland is one of the most significant sporting events we've had in Auckland, if not New Zealand, in terms of showcasing Auckland, in terms of reaching a phenomenal audience. And I just wonder what sort of economic numbers you've got around that in terms of value as it goes to brand Auckland, value as it goes to Auckland and also New Zealand. I don't need a lot, Nick, but given some of the questions that are being asked, it would be incredibly useful to get that context and to get an idea of the sort of support that Auckland Council and Auckland Unlimited would normally provide to this kind of event. Thank you.
So it is the largest event that will ever be held in New Zealand or has ever been held in New Zealand. It reaches an audience of 1.1 billion people worldwide. I don't have the direct economic impact in front of me or some of those other metrics, but it is a very significant event, and it is, you know, a critical requirement that Eden Park is central to that experience.
And just further to that, what kind of financial support or support is Auckland Council and the government giving to this event? Is Auckland Unlimited assisting? Thank you.
Yes, so Auckland Unlimited on behalf of the council group is managing the council's interface with all of the parties in Auckland. The Auckland Council is directly contributing $11 million to the delivery of the event. The New Zealand government contribution I don't have in front of me, but Richard Clark is available. And Richard, I think you might have a more detailed grasp of those numbers.
Yes, thanks, Nick. Kia ora koutou. In addition to the 11 million from Council, Auckland Unlimited is contributing 2.275 million currently in event funding, which it's important to note has been returned by New Zealand Football to go towards operational and compliance costs such as training ground developments and meeting FIFA standards. With relation to the economic benefit, the estimated GDP benefit to Auckland is $60 million from the event.
Okay, and just a supplementary question, Nick. You would expect, obviously, that businesses in Auckland will benefit significantly from this, and obviously Auckland Council will benefit through its relationships with businesses and the like. Obviously, we don't get a share of GST, but there will be obvious economic benefits to the council. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
Okay, the other very quick question I've got, and that is really in instances where we have an event such as this, and the event stacks up, under normal circumstances, our support for things to do with an event or a stadium or the like would be by way of grant rather than by way of some loan. We don't normally do loans, that's my understanding. This is a relatively simple question, and I think we've traversed it before, but what's the answer to that?
Well, I'm not the right person to answer that. I think that's a question really for Peter.
I'd bring it back to these, through you, Your Worship, bring it back to the specifics of the report in front of you. With respect to Eden Park has its own requirements under its trust deed. Those are to, if we look at the high level, and I think it's really important, they're in all of their annual reports, to administer Eden Park and the trust assets on a prudent commercial basis so that Eden Park is a successfully financially autonomous community asset. And the other point is they have asked for support around their asset maintenance plan. They also have the requirement to include appropriate reserves for capital works which the trustees consider sufficient to meet the anticipated cost of repairs, refurbishment and replacement of the grandstands, building structures and other improvements and the associated plant, machinery and equipment, or otherwise desirable to achieve the objects of the trust. So this is a case of a separate entity who has the ability to manage its own space with the debt capacity which is there, and we have provided a recommendation that if further headroom is required, we will discuss that additional headroom requirement, which seems an appropriate level of support.
And the other question, really, just for clarity, and Nick, you can probably answer it. Eden Park, I think, is the only venue in Auckland with the capacity for these type of matches with the kind of international criteria to meet FIFA's requirements. My understanding is that none of Auckland Unlimited stadiums would come anywhere near the requirements across a whole range of criteria. Would that be correct?
Eden Park is the only stadium in New Zealand that could host the opening match, the quarterfinal, semi-final, and some of those larger games. That is true.
And you expect to have very large crowds there, packed out?
Yes.
Okay, and my final question, and really that is, given that this is an international event, it's an event for New Zealand, is our council actively partnering with Eden Park to see if we can secure funding from government for some of the items that Eden Park is identifying? I note that one of them is COVID related, for example. There may be other things that government could see its way to support for such an event of such status for New Zealand.
Yes, we are all actively working with Eden Park to seek government support, given that this is a national event with national benefits. And we have been successful to a large degree. There still remain some issues which are referred to by Eden Park, and which Peter has outlined the council's response.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
I've got a couple of supplementaries to Councillor Walker's questions. Nick, you might be able to answer the first one. How much is the government putting into FIFA?
I'll have to pass that to Richard.
Richard? Microphone,
You're
Richard.
on mute.
Sorry, apologies. Total MB investment is 25 million, 14.2 to New Zealand Football for the operational costs, and then a further 11 million.
Now, second question is, FIFA is not just playing the Women's World Cup in Auckland, but across a number of cities and venues. So it would be fair to assume that if government was to pay money to one venue, it would need to pay it to all. So it wouldn't be just a case of supporting Auckland, but not supporting Wellington, Dunedin, etc.
That's correct. They have been engaged on these conversations all around the country.
Now, next supplementary question is just to clarify. So Auckland Council is already putting 13 million directly into supporting FIFA?
That's correct.
Okay. And this is an important question. We're not directly in communication with FIFA, of course, but and this could be either to Peter or to Nick, have we received any evidence that FIFA has indicated that the Eden Park facilities that served us so well last Saturday, except for the result, are not up to the standard for hosting this event. Don't know who wants to answer that one. Nick.
I'm happy to go, Peter, if you... So we've not had advice from FIFA that they are not up to scratch, but then their process of certifying and meeting those standards is an ongoing one.
Right, and if it wasn't up to scratch, then it could be brought up to scratch by virtue of the $5.2 million that they could draw down to pay for it. Is that correct? I'll address that to Peter.
Without knowing the scale of what that theoretical outcome might be, that's exactly what I would see happening with that debt capacity that they have. And as I mentioned, if that became challenged, we'd have challenges with them around that debt limit.
So in essence, we have no evidence that the FIFA competition being held in Auckland needs to be at risk in any way, given the answer you've just given me.
Given that answer I've just given you.
Thank you. The last question is the name of Councillor Shane Henderson.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And you've actually asked a number of my questions that I had. So I've just got one more following up from one of Councillor Walker's questions, which was essentially that obviously Auckland Council receives financial benefit from the staging of this tournament. I'm not clear on what our financial benefit as a group is. So could you explain that to me, please? Because the answer was yes. So I just want to know more.
Through the level of economic activity, council will indirectly through greater GDP generation benefit from that. It's a tenuous argument. I think I could, if I could spend a bit more time, I could probably give you a more specific argument than that.
That was why the answer to the question was a bit strange to me, but thank you very much. Thank you.
And I've got a supplementary to that. I presume that Eden Park itself will be a beneficiary of hosting the FIFA matches here, Nick, is that correct? They're not doing it for love.
They will receive a fee.
And that'll be a substantial fee? I don't need to know the amount. This is an open session. It's just that it's not a minor fee, is it?
It's a fee that they will have negotiated through the agreements.
And maybe just a final question. We all know that Eden Park, like ourselves, have been adversely affected by COVID, but it seems to me that there is a range of events, given the current situation that we're in, that Eden Park will be hosting through the remainder of this year and into next year that will help its financial position. Is that a fair assumption to make? Concerts and rugby matches. I think Ireland's playing there next week. They had a full house for the Blues. They've got a number of concerts there. So hopefully, or is it your assumption that post-COVID that will start to enable Eden Park to recover more funds than it's been able to in the last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of that is true. The problem is what the future looks like in a pandemic world, and the Trust Board will quite rightly, as they have done, point out that there is risk, more so than perhaps pre the pandemic.
And that's a risk that Auckland Unlimited and Auckland Council shares in the event that should happen.
We do.
Okay, I have a further question from Councillor Casey.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. It's just a follow-up to one that you asked, and it's a question of Peter, who wrote the report, and that is that under the risks section of the report, which is paragraph 35, risks and mitigations, there is no mention of the risk that the games won't go ahead. So I presume, Peter, that you are entirely confident that the stadium as it exists at the moment can meet the obligations of FIFA. Otherwise, you'd put that risk in for our edification today.
Thank you, Councillor Casey, and back through your worship. I believe that's a risk that Eden Park has the ability to manage through their debt limit and the rationale to discuss with us if it does turn out to be an issue.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the questions that I have. It's now open for any comments. So the first comment is from Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think that this is a sensible pathway forward, and I will be supporting the recommendations today. I find it difficult at times to navigate my way around some of the services of council by virtue of not being a chair of any committee. You don't always have access to officers that might work with you if you're a chair, and I really do want to applaud the leadership of Jim Stavek for making time to meet with me so that I could talk through the concerns that I had, because I was worried that Eden Park were asking for something that we couldn't deliver, but I also was worried that I wanted to ensure that Auckland and New Zealand's reputation would be intact. And I think what we're doing today is not what Eden Park want, but we are giving them the confidence of knowing that if some unforeseen situation should occur, that we can work together in partnership and resolve it. So I think it's a really sensible pathway forward. I could repeat a lot of the things that I've said in the past, and I know that you want us to be brief today, but this is a good outcome. I think it's a fair outcome, and I really want to thank the officers led by Jim Stavek for helping us navigate a point that we'll land in that can give comfort to Eden Park Trust Board in the event that something goes wrong. And that was the whole issue about whether they had headroom or not, but also isn't extravagant and profligate at a time when everyone is struggling. So thank you, and thank you to the officers.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fletcher. We now have Councillor John Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. And I guess the first point to make is exactly that we're not giving them what they asked for. Instead, we're offering up that they be able to use their existing loan capacity with Auckland Council. So whether they take up that offer or not, who knows? They may not. In which case there's no cost at all to council. I guess it's when we're talking about existing loan capacities and loans, I think it's worthwhile to remember that the main reason Eden Park is in its challenging financial position is because of the $40 million loan that came about from the Rugby World Cup when Auckland 7 councils reneged on their contribution of 50 million. In fact, it was only the ARC who came up with any contribution. That seems to be conveniently forgotten over the years. Ironically enough, a number of the people making comments or asking questions today would have been in those legacy councils that reneged on that commitment. But as they say, that's ancient history, but worth bearing in mind because that's exactly why they're in the position they are now. As far as the option that's come up for us to consider, given our own parlous financial position, I agree with that. We're just not in a position to do that because of our own very real constraints. I think a couple of comments that do emerge from this, though, is number one, for a premier event, global event such as with the FIFA World Cup, if there was no Eden Park in New Zealand, there would be no event because one of the main requirements is having at least one stadium of 50 to 60,000 people. Eden Park is the only stadium in New Zealand that has that capacity. So the comparisons to other stadiums around and having to finance them, I find a little spurious. There would be no big Rugby World Cup semi-finals and finals. There'd be no Cricket World Cup semi-finals or finals. There'd be no FIFA if it wasn't for the existence of Eden Park. And I think if we've got a failing in this as a council, it's certainly in not pushing that reality harder and more often to the government. If you look at any number of countries overseas, they have a national stadium. So if we look in Cardiff City Stadium, Aviva Stadium in Ireland, even Northern Ireland, which is a population much the same as Auckland, has its own national stadium. Eden Park is New Zealand's de facto national stadium, and it's not accurate to compare its position and its ability to attract these huge global events with Okura Park or Taranaki Stadium or some regional stadium that's the beneficiary of Eden Park being in existence. So certainly in this new council that comes up, I hope that we have a council that certainly pushes far more vigorously to the government that reality that Eden Park is New Zealand's national stadium. New Zealand is the beneficiary of Eden Park, and that there should be a consequential flow on in terms of ongoing funding to ensure that we go on to continue to attract those big and significant events. Certainly in respect of the venue as it stands at Eden Park, it really is a beneficiary to Auckland in the sense of not just that national role that it fills, but also in that community role too, in terms of the trust deed and the need for it to operate for the benefit of the people of the region. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. And let's remind ourselves that if it wasn't for Auckland cricket initially and then Auckland rugby, there would be no stadium. Those codes built the stadium, they funded it themselves, and aside from one or two relatively minor contributions in the scheme of things, the good people of Auckland and indeed New Zealand have been the beneficiaries of what amounts to a free stadium. So in amongst all the quibbling that's going on, it's perhaps worthwhile to bear that in mind. So I'll finish up, Mr. Mayor, by just saying that we've got this wonderful international event coming. It's coming to us because Eden Park's in existence. We've gone out, given our own position with a solution of sorts. It'll be up to them whether they accept it or not now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Christavi.
Thanks, Mayor. Mayor, I'll support the A and the C. Mayor, I can't support the B, Roman 1. And it's another 129,000. You know, the phrase in my mind is, here we go again. And sport really does get a massive leg up in our city, and Eden Park has had a massive leg up over a long period. And I can't help but think that, you know, this is how the America's Cup 36 unfolded. It was knock on the door again and again, and we, you know, we just keep making the offers or responding to the offers. Mayor, you know, I back the budget which creates that our loan facility, and you back that budget to create that loan facility, and I feel like I've got a really good right to say who can use our loan facility, and I just, for the life of me, cannot support a call to use that facility for this purpose. When I look at the difficulty of so many parts of our core business, you know, under stress, when I look at community houses, community coordinators, I just look across the cultural sector, I just look at the transport all over the place. You know, we've had to pare back budgets like never before, and I think to bow to this is unnecessary, and it should have all been factored in when you make your application for the FIFA event. And Mayor, I keep hearing time and time again from National Cricket Body, from other sporting entities that are using Eden Park, and I've also heard the assertion from FIFA themselves that the most expensive stadium to treat with is Eden Park, over and above the Australian stadiums. So I think there's some fundamental structural issues that have to be dealt with, and I cannot offer a dollar more. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Well, after all that, thank goodness for Eden Park. I guess that's what I would say. If we didn't have Eden Park working for the betterment of Auckland, so many of these things would not be possible. So we're incredibly fortunate that the National Stadium for New Zealand is in the best place it could be, which is in Auckland, and that we're going to be celebrating women's sport and especially women's soccer here in Auckland with phenomenal, I would suggest, economic benefits for Auckland. It's going to be wonderful for women's football at all levels, from juniors all the way through. I do not doubt that Council will also be putting effort into enhancing women's football at all levels across clubs and the like in Auckland, because there are many things that we can avail ourselves of. I remain concerned, as John Watson pointed out, that this is a national stadium, and I've said it before, this council should be leading a very comprehensive and sustained engagement with the government around Eden Park, which is our national stadium, around Auckland Museum, which has got more treasures than Te Papa, certainly in terms of Māori and Pacifica, our Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra, which is phenomenal. And where are we in terms of backing these things to the extent that we need to? And that is certainly the case in overseas cities and other cities where stadiums like Eden Park receive far more support from the government. I would say that Eden Park forecast these costs quite some time ago. They were subject to review by EY, so none of these things are surprises, and every stadium, particularly when it has an international event, should be up to the mark. Fortunately, there is some borrowing capacity, but obviously Eden Park should be prudent, and as we know, Eden Park is in a trust that acts for the benefit of Auckland. And I would suggest, as Nick Hill has emphasised on a number of occasions, we need to be measuring things by what is best for Auckland, and best for Auckland in this instance should be supporting Eden Park to every extent we can, and certainly in that instance, 125 or 129,000 is a tiny amount of money for Auckland Council to be quibbling over for such a meritorious event. So thank you, Eden Park, for presenting to us, providing us the information. It's disappointing that it's not able to be a grant, but we may be able to revisit that in the future, and I would hope so. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Sorry, actually, did Bill want to finish up? I think there's a few disappointing statements, and it doesn't surprise me. You know, we always hear from Eden Park, you know, that that Auckland Council is at risk of saying we've got failing facilities. We were reminded quite explicitly from the trustee that Eden Park Trust Board is an autonomous board. It is not owned by the people of Auckland at all. And so the responsibility for asset management falls squarely on the Eden Park Trust Board. And I would say, you know, it isn't a national stadium. If it was, the government would be falling over itself. But it's all going to go to the new Christchurch Stadium. You just watch. They're in trouble. Christchurch will get that money. But the government should be putting money into this. And we can't keep patching it up. I mean, I voted against a grant last time, and I certainly would not support it this time. Not, you know, and we say, people say, oh, 129,000 isn't much money. My local boards would love that. Every local board would love a bit more discretionary funding. You know, and for people hearing us saying throw away things like 125,000 isn't much money, that is a lot of money. And I think we're being really generous here, paying for that interest. I will support this because I think it's a really good, you know, we are supporting Eden Park so we can have this event. But I'll tell you what, not 1 cent is really going to come back to us, not to our budget. And we've just struggled for gosh, it feels like the last 2.5 years we've been struggling with our budgets and telling people they can't have things. We've even signalled next year that we might be cutting services. But there's some people are blithely happy to just give the money away. Yeah, so I don't support that. But I also need to just rectify something when we were told that some legacy councils reneged on their responsibility to give money to Eden Park to the 2011 World Cup. Waitakere City never reneged because we never could give the money because we couldn't borrow. And we've been criticised for having a lot of borrowings when we came to this government, to this amalgamation. But also our community said no. So we said, no, we can't do it. So there was no reneging, and I don't like that those aspersions being cast on my previous council. But I think this is a really good solution, and I hope that Eden Park take it up and eat a bit of humble pie for a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kathy Casey.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I'll be really short. What I would like to say to Eden Park is just to tell them to stop coming to Auckland ratepayers cap in hand. If you are a national stadium, get on a plane and go to Wellington and fight your case there. We have been very kind to you in this term of council. We've already given you almost $10 million as a gift with no strings attached. And as you heard from the Mayor today, we were already funding FIFA. We're funding FIFA to the value of $30 million in services. So we are doing you proud. We have done you proud. It has to stop. I don't want to feel guilty. If you, $125,000, put it in the PACE committee's bucket for regional funds, and you would make so many groups happy. Yeah, and I, like you, Linda, I resent that, it's just a throwaway $125,000. We are actually doing massive amounts we can do massive amounts of good work with $125,000 across Auckland. And, just on the local boards, they weren't asked. And I can almost guarantee if you ask them, should we be gifting another $129,000 to Eden Park, which is effectively what this is, I think you get a resounding no, but we didn't do that. So it's a no from me for B, like Councillor Darby, so I'm very happy for you to take that separately. But I'm not feeling guilty over this, and I hate being made feel guilty by other councillors that somehow we're not doing right by Eden Park. Eden Park is not our stadium. Good on you, Linda. Eden Park is not owned by us, and we could put that $129,000 to much better use. So it's a no from me.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Daniel Newman.
Yeah, I hate discussions about Eden Park these days because it conjures up this kind of stuff, and from people, all of whom I regard as my friend, but it just seems to just generate such a visceral response. I mean, if it were up to me, I'd do it in the form of a grant. I'd just write the loan off, and I know people say, why would he do that? Well, actually, there is an incredibly significant difference in the EBITDA results between this stadium and any other stadium in Auckland. It's a good stadium, and it is New Zealand's stadium, and I'm proud of it as an Aucklander, and I feel it does belong to all of us, and I'm on the side of it succeeding. So I'm Chair. I mean, look, for this this isn't the optimal outcome, but I do hope that what this is not the start of is a case of the council winding down the clock with a view to achieving an outcome through the consolidated operator model, whereby we in effect try and constrain the Eden Park Trust Board, which is my concern. Ultimately, I think we should be blind to ownership when it comes to stadia, and back the one stadia in Auckland that I think is a real success, which is Eden Park.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Richard Hills.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't going to speak, but yeah, I do. I guess I feel like we're in a good space with Eden Park, and Auckland Unlimited at the moment. It is really important that we're all working together. They did ask for substantially more than this offer from us. There are issues with FIFA that we just need to get on with. I'm not seeing the controversy, but I'm also not seeing the need for the back and forth on this issue again. And also I'm supporting all three of these because it's just important that we work with them, and Auckland Unlimited back this. It's not like last time, it's quite different. And FIFA will be amazing for our city, but we have already invested as well. So yeah, I think there's some odd kind of arguments happening here. But the other thing is that some comments around budget, well, it's important to vote for a budget and support a budget. And this money will come from the budget we endorse again next week. So I hope that people are thinking that way, because actually this has been a very difficult time for so many facilities in our city and every bit of related work for our council. But people don't see Eden Park as some big commercial entity anyway. They see it as another community asset, in my opinion. So I think this is a reasonable under the situation, and we are working for, in my opinion, the first time really well with Eden Park and Auckland Unlimited together. And I think it's important to support this because of the relationship. That's all. I think Aucklanders expect us to. So, but some of the disappointing comments on today, just this situation again on Eden Park. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I just want to make a contribution. Look, I support A, B and C as a pragmatic solution to the challenges that we have in front of us. I could not possibly support and did not support last time granting tens of millions of dollars to an organisation that we neither own nor control. The request obviously from Eden Park is a large one, 6.28 million a year. That's 62.8 million. Let me say that slowly, 62.8 million over 10 years. We don't have that money, and if we had that money, I'm not sure that I could give preference to Eden Park over the many other sporting organisations that all have a call for more funding to help sport on the ground. I understand the problems that Eden Park has at the moment because of COVID, but Council is itself facing a pretty challenging time. We've got increasing costs and we are still dealing with lingering revenue losses from COVID. If we were to meet the request by Eden Park, we would be borrowing that money. And I do not support borrowing that money. I don't think it's fair on Eden Park to say, we don't want to borrow money because it adds to our debt, but it's okay for you to borrow money to add to the debt and put it on the ratepayer. And I'm not prepared to do that. But I am prepared to support this because I think it's a pragmatic way forward. Let me just address FIFA. I've been a strong supporter of bringing FIFA and work to bring FIFA to Auckland, and we will host FIFA here. I have seen no evidence whatsoever that FIFA, other than intends to have its opening and its semi-final match at Eden Park. And if there is a problem with any of the facilities, then we have offered the solution to Eden Park to solve that problem, withdrawing down the last of its loan and with a very concessional loan with no interest payable in the first year. What we have to do outside of this, of course, is address the underlying problem that Eden Park and indeed the other stadiums face. And we're doing that through the single operator stadium strategy, and that will hopefully be in place within a year's time. But we're not going to cut across those discussions by saying, here's 62.8 million and it's a gift from the ratepayers of Auckland to you. We need to work with Eden Park collaboratively, cooperatively, to resolve their challenges and our challenges. One of their challenges is that they have not put any money aside for depreciation of their facility. Now, we are walking over broken glass on this council to fully fund our depreciation by 2028, because we know that's what it's sensible to do, that you have to do that if you're a prudent financial manager. And Eden Park can't go on not depreciating, not fully funding its, or even partially funding its depreciation, because it knows that there are huge capital costs ahead for Eden Park. So it needs to address that, and we need to work with them in a cooperative way to make sure that we make the most of the stadium facilities that we have across Auckland. And as the reports we've had from Auckland Unlimited show, those discussions are going in a constructive and a positive direction. So we've already done a lot to help Eden Park, regardless of what some of the criticisms have been. We have a loan of $46 million to them. I don't support writing that off. Why would we write off a loan to a private organisation? It's not our money to write off, it's the Auckland ratepayers' money. But this is a sensible and a pragmatic solution. I'm very pleased to hear a range of councillors from different perspectives on Eden Park getting in behind it and supporting it. And I certainly endorse all three of the recommendations. Now, I'm not sure whether I'm closing. I think the Deputy Mayor might like to close as the mover of the resolution.
I think the Mayor's just taken my speech notes. But basically, Eden Park has a short-term problem that's annual, and we need to have that solution. And Nick talked about the single stadium operating model, and the Mayor's also mentioned it. That is potentially going to be the future. That's the decision we're going to make, hopefully before the end of this term. And that is the operating model, and then there's the capital model probably to come beyond that. So there is solutions here, and we just need to find a way through, because the one comment that has been right all the way from all sides of this debate is that Eden Park is in Auckland and it is the national stadium. And we need to find the right pathway to deliver a quality, safe and working stadium that makes as much return on capital investment as it possibly can. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put A and C first, and then I will take B separately, because it's been indicated that there is some dissent from B. What I'm putting in front of you now, councillors, is recommendation A and C. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Aye. And B by division, Mr. Mayor?
Sorry, let me finish this vote first, please, councillor. Those opposed to A and C. So I declare A and C passed unanimously. We come now to clause B. There has been a request for a division on recommendation B, and I will ask Sandra to call the vote on that division.
Councillors, you're voting on item 13, clause B1. Mayor Goff.
Aye. Aye.
Councillor Bartley.
What?
Councillor Casey.
No.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Aye.
Councillor Collins.
For.
Councillor Coombe.
Aye.
Councillor Cooper.
Aye.
Councillor Dalton.
Aye.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipina.
Aye.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes.
Councillor Henderson.
For.
Councillor Hills.
In favour, thank you.
Was that yes, Councillor Hills?
In favour.
I'm so sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my computer today. That's a yes.
Thank you. Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
In favour.
Councillor Sayers.
Abstain.
Councillor Simpson.
For.
Councillor Stewart.
For.
Councillor Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson.
For.
Councillor Young.
For.
That's carried 18 votes to 2 with 1 abstention.
So I will declare that recommendation B passed and recommendations A to C passed. Thank you very much, councillors, for your contribution on that issue. We now come to item number 13, a summary of the governing body information memoranda.